Okay, yes, I believe that we are live. So, hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, in whatever part of the world you may happen to be in. I'm in this part of the world, right here, down in the basement with the cats. Hi, I'm Tad. You are my friends, and we are all here. And it is 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening in Northern California, and plus or minus that, wherever in the world you may be. And yeah, I'm going to read. I'm going to explain in a second, if you're not already clear on it, what I'm going to be reading and why. First off, just in the way of news, of any news, I am now working on The Splintered Sun, as I mentioned last night, which is the new novel, which is a great pleasure to be at the point where I'm actually finally writing things. Because that's a whole new set of decisions to make and things to think about in terms of how the book is going to read. So I have a very good, strong general idea of the plot because, of course, I outlined this first a year and a half ago or so and have been working on other projects, most notably finishing The Navigator's Children and the rewrite of the Third Ordinary Farm book. But now those are off my virtual desk, as it were, my metaphorical desk. I am now able to, when I have some work time, I'm able to start The Splintered Sun. I'm also still signing a lot of tip-in pages for various editions. I seem to be at the various editions stage of my life and career, which is not a complaint because they're beautiful editions. And signing is a small price to pay for getting reissues with beautiful new covers and things like that. But it does take time, so I'm always fighting to find time to actually write, which, despite my vast age and my clear senility, I still believe is my job, and I still want to do my job. Anyway, so family is all good. I think you can hear various cat things happening in the background. Animals are good. Johnny is still nervous as always. Walter is still slightly nutso as always. The cats down here, PJ and TJ, are going to be roving around behind me. I'm sure you'll see them. So, to quickly reiterate what I said not last night, earlier this morning, I guess, the 1 o'clock reading. I decided I was going to be doing something different because I definitely want to continue reading short stories or at least material by other writers who have influenced me. The problem I was discovering was the immense frustration of not being able to get to the stories that I know I have that are actually my books, which are many of them still packed away. They're out in the garage. Some of them are probably in here, but they're still in boxes, and I haven't found them yet. And also the problem with trying to figure out ahead of time how you're going to break up stories if you can't finish them within the time allotted. But mostly it's having to do with the fact that I'd already spent like $100 buying digital copies of things that I already knew I had copies of, or in some cases not being able to find the stories I wanted and buying other collections instead. And at a certain point I went, I've spent my entire life accruing books, and just because I temporarily can't get to them, I don't really want to replace them all with new copies, as useful as it is to have digital copies. So as a result, I said, what else can I do while I'm waiting to find all of my books that are packed away? And I realized that one of the books I had alluded to a couple of times was The Wind in the Willows. And again, just to briefly summarize here, The Wind in the Willows is super important to me for a number of reasons. First of all, it was a very distinct bond between my mom and I, who used to read books to me when I was a kid, and who turned me on to a lot of the early things that I wound up falling in love with, including fantasy fiction, starting with books like The Wind in the Willows, but then she was the one who first gave me The Lord of the Rings, and things of that nature. And as you all know, we lost my mom and dad, or our mom and dad, over the last few years, my mom in 2022 and dad last summer. And during the last weeks she was in the hospital, I was bringing Wind in the Willows in to read to her, but I never got to finish it. So I feel, in a sense, that's an incomplete thing. That's something that I didn't get to do for my mom while she was alive, but it's still important to me. It's also just, and I think this is equally important, it's not just a sentimental thing. It's also just that this is a book that influenced me strongly. And as I mentioned during the 1 o'clock reading, it was one of the first things, along with some of my other favorite childhood books, that kind of gave me the idea of a world that is right around you, that is all around us, that we can't perceive most of the time. And this, of course, has become a huge trope in fantasy and science fiction as well, and magic realism. So that was really important to me. But also, it's just a really well-written book. It is not a book explicitly written for children. It's not written down to children. The language is robust. The descriptions are beautiful, especially the descriptions of nature. It betrays a huge love of the countryside, in this case, the English countryside. But it also, and this is important as well, it also is peculiarly English. Not least because almost all the characters are bachelors. There are a few children that show up, and there's some human female people that show up later in the story, but primarily it is this odd British fantasy thing of that you see, and particularly perhaps because of the nature of the people who wrote a lot of these great British young people's fantasy books. A lot of them are bachelors. Go figure. Anyway, that is not what the reason I picked the book, as I mentioned, but I think it's an interesting thing about it is that it covers a lot of ground that became important to me later in life. And not just the books themselves, which opened up a lot of fantasy for me, but the whole idea of the trip on the river was echoed in the Storyland boat ride in Disneyland when I was a little kid. And I realized only years after I'd written the other Land books that they were a direct product, in part, of that trip when I was 5 or 6. And we went on the Fairyland boat ride, and the idea of a river with bits of anything on the side of it, on the banks that you would go past, and you'd go past Sleeping Beauty's castle or Toad Hall, or any number of other interesting places out of fairy tales, obviously. Snow White's cottage, or the dwarf's cottage, I guess, since Snow just kind of moved in. But that was such a strong effect on me that it eventually led me to writing the other Land books, and I didn't realize that for many years. And in fact, I think I was in Germany doing, a reading, book signing tour or something and somebody asked me, why did you write the other Land books? What made that happen? And I was starting to tell them the story that I remembered, which was something much later from my adulthood and an interview I heard. And that was also true. But as I was saying it, I suddenly realized, oh my God, I'm totally wrong. I missed something even more important that happened really early. And I'm sure that was a big part. And then told them about the Disneyland Fantasyland boat ride, or whatever it's called, fairy tale boat ride. I don't know. Doesn't matter. So this is a book that the sentimental connections aside, and the sentimental connections obviously very important to me, but also it was formative for me in many, many ways. So I hope you will put up with all of that and enjoy the story, because it's a brilliant book. And it would be a brilliant book whether it was written for adults or written for kids, or just what it is, which is just a great fantasy tale. Okay, before I do that, before I start reading again, however, let me just go and check and see if any people have checked in and if there's anybody I should say hello to. And my wife Deborah says, Fairy Book Land. No, although it had some combination of some of those words in it. I think it was the Fairy Tale Boat Ride or Fairyland Boat Ride. But anyway, so that's my wife. Hi, Deb. Hey, sweetie. Good to see you. Who else is here? Angie. Hello, Angie. Pierre. Pierre has the coolest name. Pierre Danger, although I like to pronounce it Danger to go with Pierre. Pierre Danger Fuqua. Winter. Hello. Good to see you. Jeremy. A pleasure, my friend. Kelly. Good to see you too. Mr. Unangst. Ray Weatherford. Isaac. Hello, Isaac. Hello, Claudia. Hello, Mark. Good to see you, sir. Joanna and Susan and Christy. And that's who I have on board at the moment. And, oh, yes, here we go, too. All right. And yes. So, all right. So everybody at least that has checked in, I have said hello to. And I'm about to start reading. So just a quick synopsis of what we've already heard. Mole was doing his spring cleaning. He suddenly got to a point in it where he said, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, of course, because Mole wouldn't have said it this way, but it says, bugger this, I'm going to go do something else. And he climbs up out of his house in the ground and is dashing around in the riverside meadow and meets the water rat. And the water rat is a friendly fellow, and he sort of takes Mole under his, almost said wing, which would be very much mixing a metaphor, but he essentially takes up Mole and says, I'm going to teach you about, life on the river and all this. And Mole, you get the impression, Mole's another bachelor who's never much been out of his area of comfort before, and but turns out to love all of the experiences he's having on the river and living in Rat's house while he learns how to row, how to use the sculls on a rowing boat and all this kind of stuff. Then one day they go to visit Mr. Toad, and Mr. Toad, we've already heard about in the story, is famous for his crazes, his fashions that he picks up, mostly to do with vehicles. And he had previously been through many different kinds of boats and was always out boating, and they've actually seen him out boating rather badly because, of course, he never sticks with anything very long. So they go over to visit Mr. Toad, and the subject of boating comes up, and Mr. Toad essentially says, oh, that old nonsense. I don't know why any of you ever got involved with that, and I certainly am not interested in it anymore. I have found the real thing. And Rat is a little bit nonplussed by this, but Mr. Toad takes them out of his huge ancestral mansion, Toad Hall, and takes them to see what is referred to in this book as a gypsy wagon, which is basically the kind of wagon that in the old days all kinds of people traveling, tinkers and whatnot, would go around in, being pulled by a horse or two, or a mule or donkey. And but this, of course, is a very beautiful, very tasteful, beautifully painted, beautifully appointed wagon with four wheels. And I think we actually did we see a picture of it? Yes, we did. So this is a picture of, all right, there we go. There is a picture of Mr. Toad's new wagon. And Toad is trying to introduce them to it. So we now continue with The Wind in the Willows, and this chapter, which we've already begun, is called The Open Road. The mole was tremendously interested and excited, and followed Toad eagerly up the steps and into the interior of the caravan. The rat only snorted and thrust his hand... Let me start that one again. The rat only snorted and thrust his hands deep into his pockets, remaining where he was. It was indeed very compact and comfortable. Little sleeping bunks, a little table that folded up against the wall, a cooking stove, lockers, bookshelves, a bird cage with a bird in it, and pots, pans, jugs, and kettles of every size and variety. All complete, said the Toad triumphantly, pulling open a locker. You see, biscuits, potted lobster, sardines, everything you could possibly want. Soda water here, baccy there, letter paper, bacon, jam, cards, and dominoes. You'll find, he continued as they descended the steps again, you'll find that nothing whatever has been forgotten. when we make our start this afternoon." "I beg your pardon," said the rat slowly as he chewed a straw, "but did I overhear you say something about we and start and this afternoon?" "Now, you dear good old ratty," said Toad imploringly, "don't begin talking in that stiff and sniffy sort of way, because you know you've got to come. I can't possibly manage without you, so please consider it settled. Don't argue. It's the one thing I can't stand. You surely don't mean to stick in your dull, fusty old river all your life and just live in a hole in a bank and boat. I want to show you the world. I'm going to make an animal of you, my boy." "I don't care," said the rat doggedly. "I'm not coming, and that's flat. And I am going to stick to my old driver, to my old river, and live in a hole and boat, as I've always done. And what's more, Mole's going to stick to me and do as I do, aren't you, Mole?" "Of course I am," said the Mole loyally. "I'll always stick to you, Rat, and what you say is to be has got to be. All the same, it sounds as if it might have been, well, rather fun, you know," he added wistfully. Poor Mole. The life adventurous was so new a thing to him and so thrilling, and this fresh aspect of it was so tempting. And he had fallen in love at first sight with the canary-colored cart and all its little fitments. The rat saw what was passing in his mind and wavered. He hated disappointing people, and he was fond of the Mole and would do almost anything to oblige him. Toad was watching both of them closely. "Come along in and have some lunch," he said diplomatically, "and we'll talk it over. We needn't decide anything in a hurry. Of course, I don't really care. I only want to give pleasure to you fellows. Live for others, that's my motto in life." During luncheon, which was excellent, of course, as everything at Toad Hall always was, the Toad simply let himself go. Disregarding the rat, he proceeded to play upon the inexperienced Mole as on a harp. Naturally a voluble animal, and always mastered by his imagination, he painted the prospects of the trip and the joys of the open life and the roadside in such glowing colors that the Mole could hardly sit in his chair for excitement. Somehow, it soon seemed taken for granted by all three of them that the trip was a settled thing, and the rat, though still unconvinced in his mind, allowed his good nature to override his personal objections. He could not bear to disappoint his two friends, who were already deep in schemes and anticipations, planning out each day's separate occupation for several weeks ahead. When they were quite ready, the now triumphant Toad led his companions to the paddock and set them to capture the old gray horse, who, without having been consulted and to his own extreme annoyance, had been told off by Toad for the dustiest job in this dusty expedition. He frankly preferred the paddock and took a deal of catching. And here's a picture of, there you go, the animals trying their best. It's really hard to figure out with this thing showing up backward. There we go. There's the animals running after the old gray horse. Meantime, Toad packed the lockers still tighter with necessaries and hung nose bags, nets of onions, bundles of hay, and baskets from the bottom of the cart. At last the horse was caught and harnessed, and they set off, all talking at once, each animal either trudging by the side of the cart or sitting on the shaft as the humor took him. It was a golden afternoon. The smell of the dust they kicked up was rich and satisfying. Out of thick orchards on either side of the road, birds called and whistled to them cheerily. Good-natured wayfarers passing them gave them "good day," or stopped to say nice things about their beautiful cart. And rabbits, sitting at their front doors in the hedgerows, held up their forepaws and said, "Oh my! Oh my! Oh my!" Late in the evening, tired and happy and miles from home, they drew up on a remote common, far from habitations, turned the horse loose to graze, and ate their simple supper, sitting on the grass by the side of the cart. Toad talked big about all he was going to do in the days to come, while stars grew fuller and larger all around them, and a yellow moon, appearing suddenly and silently from nowhere in particular, came to keep them company and listen to their talk. At last they turned into their little bunks in the cart, and Toad, kicking out his legs, sleepily said, "Well, good night, you fellows. This is the real life for a gentleman. Talk about your old river." "I don't talk about my river," replied the patient rat. "You know I don't, Toad. But I think about it," he added pathetically in a lower tone. "I think about it all the time." The mole reached out from under his blanket, felt for the rat's paw in the darkness, and gave it a squeeze. "I'll do whatever you like, Ratty," he whispered. "Shall we run away tomorrow morning, quite early, very early, and go back to our dear old hole on the river?" No, we'll see it out," whispered back the rat. "Thanks awfully, but I ought to stick by Toad till this trip is ended. It wouldn't be safe for him to be left to himself. It won't take very long. His fads never do. Good night." The end was indeed nearer than even the rat suspected. After so much open air and excitement, the Toad slept very soundly, and no amount of shaking could rouse him out of bed next morning. So the mole and rat turned to, quietly and manfully, and while the rat saw to the horse, and lit a fire, and cleaned last night's cups and platters, and got things ready for breakfast, the mole trudged off to the nearest village, a long way off, for milk and eggs and various necessities the Toad had, of course, forgotten to provide. The hard work had all been done, and the two animals were resting, thoroughly exhausted, by the time Toad appeared on the scene, fresh and gay, remarking what a pleasant, easy life it was they were all leading now, after the cares and worries and fatigues of housekeeping at home. They had a pleasant ramble that day over grassy downs and along narrow by-lanes, and camped as before on a common, only this time the two guests took care that Toad should do his fair share of work. In consequence, when the time came for starting next morning, Toad was by no means so rapturous about the simplicity of the primitive life, and indeed attempted to resume his place in the bunk, whence he was hauled by force. And here is Toad being hauled from his bunk by force. Their way lay, as before, across country by narrow lanes, and it was not till the afternoon that they came out on the high road, their first high road. And there, disaster, fleet and unforeseen, sprang out on them. Disaster momentous indeed to their expedition, but simply overwhelming in its effect on the after career of Toad. They were strolling along the high road easily, the mole by the horse's head, talking to him, since the horse had complained that he was being frightfully left out of it, and nobody considered him in the least. The Toad and the water rat walking behind the cart, talking together. At least Toad was talking, and Rat was saying at intervals, "Yes, precisely, and what did you say to him?" and thinking all the time of something very different. When far behind them they heard a faint warning hum, like the drone of a distant bee. Glancing back, they saw a small cloud of dust with a dark center of energy advancing on them at incredible speed, while from out the dust a faint boop, boop wailed like an uneasy animal in pain. Hardly regarding it, they turned to resume their conversation, when, in an instant, as it seemed, the peaceful scene was changed, and with a blast of wind and a whirl of sound that made them jump for the nearest ditch, it was on them. The boop, boop rang with a brazen shout in their ears. They had a moment's glimpse of an interior of glittering plate glass and rich Morocco, and the magnificent motor car, immense, breath-snatching, passionate, with its pilot tense and hugging his wheel, possessed all earth and air for the fraction of a second, flung an enveloping cloud of dust that blinded and unwrapped them utterly, and then dwindled to a speck in the far distance, changed back into a droning bee once more. The old gray horse, dreaming, as he plodded along of his quiet paddock, in a new raw situation such as this, simply abandoned himself to his natural emotions, rearing, plunging, backing steadily in spite of all the mole's efforts at his head and all the mole's lively language directed at his better feelings. He drove the cart backward towards the deep ditch at the side of the road. It wavered an instant. Then there was a heart-rending crash, and the canary-colored cart, their pride and their joy, lay on its side in the ditch, an irredeemable wreck. And here is both the villainous but exciting motor car and the loss of the cart just about to happen. By the way, for those of you who weren't with me last night, this is the edition illustrated by Ernest Shepard, who is one of my very, very favorites. He also did the extremely well-known and famous Winnie the Pooh and House at Pooh Corner illustrations, and A.A. Milne's poetry books for kids when we were very young and now we are 6, and many others. But those are the ones he's still primarily known for 100 years later. The rat danced up and down in the road, simply transported with passion. "You villains!" he shouted, shaking both fists. "You scoundrels! You highwaymen! You road hogs! I'll have the law of you! I'll report you! I'll take you all through the courts!" His homesickness had quite slipped away from him, and for the moment he was the skipper of the canary-colored vessel, driven on a shoal by the reckless jockeying of rival mariners, and he was trying to recollect all the fine and biting things he used to say to masters of steam launches when their wash, as they drove too near the bank, used to flood his parlor carpet at home. Toad sat straight down in the middle of the dusty road, his legs stretched out before him, and stared fixedly in the direction of the disappearing motor car. He breathed short. His face wore a placid, satisfied expression, and at intervals he faintly murmured, "Poop, poop." The mole was busy trying to quiet the horse, which he succeeded in doing after a time. Then he went to look at the cart on its side in the ditch. It was indeed a sorry sight. Panels and windows smashed, axles hopelessly bent, one wheel off, sardine tins scattered over the wide world, and the bird in the birdcage sobbing pitifully and calling to be let out. The rat came to help him, but their united efforts were not sufficient to right the cart. "Hi, Toad!" they cried. "Come and bear a hand, can't you?" The toad never answered a word or budged from his seat in the road, so they went to see what was the matter with him. They found him in a sort of trance, a happy smile on his face, his eyes still fixed on the dusty wake of their destroyer. At intervals he was still heard to murmur, "Poop, poop, poop, poop." The rat shook him by the shoulder. "Are you coming to help us, Toad?" he demanded sternly. "Glorious, stirring sight," murmured Toad, never offering to move. "The poetry of motion, the real way to travel, the only way to travel. Here today, in next week, tomorrow, villages skipped, towns and cities jumped, all with somebody else's horizon. Oh, bliss! Oh, poop, poop! Oh, my! Oh, my! Oh, stop being an ass, Toad!" cried the mole despairingly. "And to think I never knew," went on the toad in a dreamy monotone, "all those wasted years that lie behind me. I never knew, never even dreamt. But now that I know, now that I fully realize,
Oh, what a flowery track lies spread before me henceforth! What dust clouds shall spring up behind me as I speed on my reckless way? What carts I shall fling carelessly into the ditch in the wake of my magnificent onset! Horrid little carts, common carts, canary-coloured carts.
"What are we to do with him?" asked the Mole of the Water Rat.
"Nothing at all," replied the Rat firmly, "because there is really nothing to be done. You see, I know him from old. He is now possessed. He has got a new craze, and it always takes him that way, in its first stage. He'll continue like that for days now, like an animal walking in a happy dream, quite useless for all practical purposes. Never mind him. Let's go and see what there is to be done about the cart."
A careful inspection showed them that even if they succeeded in righting it by themselves, the cart would travel no longer. The axles were in a hopeless state, and the missing wheel was shattered into pieces. The Rat knotted the horse's reins over his back and took him by the head, carrying the birdcage and its hysterical occupant in the other hand.
"Come on," he said grimly to the Mole. "It's 5 or 6 miles to the nearest town, and we shall just have to walk it. The sooner we make a start, the better."
"But what about Toad?" asked the Mole anxiously as they set off together. "We can't leave him here, sitting in the middle of the road by himself in the distracted state he's in. It's not safe. Supposing another thing were to come along."
"Oh, bother Toad," said the Rat savagely. "I've done with him."
They had not proceeded very far on their way, however, when there was a pattering of feet behind them, and Toad caught them up and thrust a paw inside the elbow of each of them, still breathing short and staring into vacancy.
"Now, look here, Toad," said the Rat sharply. "As soon as we get to the town, you'll have to go straight to the police station and see if they know anything about that motor car and who it belongs to, and lodge a complaint against it. And then you'll have to go to a blacksmith's or a wheelwright's in exchange for the cart to be fetched and mended and put to rights. It'll take time, but it's not quite a hopeless smash. Meanwhile, the Mole and I will go to an inn and find comfortable rooms where we can stay till the cart's ready, until your nerves have recovered their shock."
"Police station? Complaint?" murmured Toad dreamily. "Me complain of that beautiful, that heavenly vision that hath been vouchsafed me? Mend the cart? I've done with carts forever. I never want to see the cart or to hear of it again. Oh, Ratty, you can't think how obliged I am to you for consenting to come on this trip. I wouldn't have gone without you, and then I might never have seen that swan, that sunbeam, that thunderbolt. I might never have heard that entrancing sound or smelt that bewitching smell. I owe it all to you, my best of friends." The Rat turned from him in despair.
"You see what it is," he said to the Mole, addressing him across Toad's head. "He's quite hopeless. I give it up. When we get to the town, we'll go to the railway station, and with luck, we may pick up a train there that'll get us back to Riverbank tonight. And if you ever catch me going a-pleasuring with this provoking animal again—"
He snorted, and during the rest of that weary trudge addressed his remarks exclusively to Mole. On reaching the town, they went straight to the station and deposited Toad in the second-class waiting room, giving a porter 2d to keep a strict eye on him. They then left the horse at an inn stable and gave what directions they could about the cart and its contents. Eventually, a slow train having landed them at a station not very far from Toad Hall, they escorted the spellbound, sleep-walking Toad to his door, put him inside it, and instructed his housekeeper to feed him, undress him, and put him to bed. Then they got out their boat from the boathouse, sculled down the river home,
and at a very late hour sat down to supper in their own cozy riverside parlor, to the rat's great joy and contentment. The following evening, the mole, who had risen late and taken things very easy all day, was sitting on the bank fishing, when the rat, who had been looking up his friends and gossiping, came strolling along to find him. "Heard the news?" he said. "There's nothing else being talked about all along the river bank. Toad went up to town by an early train this morning, and he has ordered a large and very expensive motor car." Chapter 3. The Wild Wood. The mole had long wanted to make the acquaintance of the badger. He seemed, by all accounts, to be such an important personage, and, though rarely visible, to make his unseen influence felt by everybody about the place. But whenever the mole mentioned his wish to the water rat, he always found himself put off. "It's all right," the rat would say. "Badger'll turn up some day or other. He's always turning up. And then I'll introduce you. The best of fellows. But you must not only take him as you find him, but when you find him." Couldn't you ask him here? Dinner or something?" said the mole. "He wouldn't come," replied the rat simply. "Badger hates society and invitations and dinner and all that sort of thing." "Well, then, supposing we go and call on him," suggested the mole. "Oh, I'm sure he wouldn't like that at all," said the rat, quite alarmed. "He's so very shy, he'd be sure to be offended. I've never even ventured to call on him at his home myself, though I know him so well. Besides, we can't. It's quite out of the question, because he lives in the very middle of the wild wood." "Well, supposing he does," said the mole. "You told me the wild wood was all right, you know." "Oh, I know, so it is," replied the rat evasively. "But I think we won't go there just now, not just yet. It's a long way, and he wouldn't be at home at this time of the year anyhow. And he'll be coming along some day, if you'll wait quietly." The mole had to be content with this, but the badger never came along, and every day brought its amusements, and it was not till summer was long over, and cold and frost and miry ways kept them much indoors, and the swollen river raced past outside their windows with a speed that mocked at boating of any sort or kind, that he found his thoughts dwelling again with much persistence on the solitary gray badger, who lived his own life by himself in his hole in the middle of the wild wood. In the winter time, the rat slept a great deal, retiring early and rising late. During his short day, he sometimes scribbled poetry or did other small domestic jobs about the house, and of course there were always animals dropping in for a chat, and consequently there was a great deal of storytelling and comparing notes on the past summer and all its doings. Such a rich chapter it had been when one came to look back on it all, with illustrations so numerous and so very highly colored. The pageant of the riverbank had marched steadily along, unfolding itself in scene pictures that succeeded each other in stately procession. Purple loosestrife arrived early, shaking luxuriant tangled locks along the edge of the mirror, whence its own face laughed back at it. Willow herb, tender and wistful, like a pink sunset cloud, was not slow to follow. Comfrey, the purple hand in hand with the white, crept forth to take its place in the line, and at last, one morning, the diffident and delaying dog Rose stepped delicately on the stage, and one knew, as if string music had announced it in stately chords that strayed into a gavotte, that June at last was here. One member of the company was still awaited, the shepherd boy for the nymphs to woo, the knight for whom the ladies waited at the window, the prince that was to kiss the sleeping summer back to life and love. But when Meadow Sweet, debonair and odorous in amber jerkin, moved graciously to his place in the group, then the play was ready to begin. And what a play it had been! Drowsy animals, snug in their holes while wind and rain were battering at their doors, recalled still keen mornings, an hour before sunrise, when the white mist, as yet undispersed, clung closely along the surface of the water, then the shock of the early plunge, the scamper along the bank, and the radiant transformation of earth, air, and water, when suddenly the sun was with them again, and gray was gold, and color was born, and sprang out of the earth once more. They recalled the languorous siesta of hot midday, deep in green undergrowth, the sun striking through in tiny golden shafts and spots, the boating and bathing of the afternoon, the rambles along dusty lanes and through yellow cornfields, and the long, cool evening at last, when so many threads were gathered up, so many friendships rounded, and so many adventures planned for the morrow. There was plenty to talk about on those short winter days when the animals found themselves round the fire. Still, the mole had a good deal of spare time on his hands, and so one afternoon, when the rat in his armchair before the blaze was alternately dozing and trying over rhymes that wouldn't fit, he formed the resolution to go out by himself and explore the wild wood, and perhaps strike up an acquaintance with Mr. Badger. It was a cold, still afternoon with a hard, steely sky overhead when he slipped out of the warm parlor into the open air. The country lay bare and entirely leafless around him, and he thought that he had never seen so far and so intimately into the insides of things as on that winter day when nature was deep in her annual slumber and seemed to have kicked the clothes off. Copses, dells, quarries, and all hidden places, which had been mysterious mines for exploration in leafy summer, now exposed themselves and their secrets pathetically, and seemed to ask him to overlook their shabby poverty for a while, till they could riot in rich masquerade as before, and trick and entice him with the old deceptions. It was pitiful in a way, and yet cheering, even exhilarating. He was glad that he liked the country undecorated, hard, and stripped of its finery. He had got down to the bare bones of it, and they were fine and strong and simple. He did not want the warm clover and the play of seeding grasses. The screens of quickset, the billowy drapery of beech and elm seemed best away, and with great cheerfulness of spirit he pushed on towards the wild wood, which lay before him, low and threatening, like a black reef in some still southern sea. There was nothing to alarm him at first entry. Twigs crackled under his feet, logs tripped him, funguses on stumps resembled caricatures, and startled him for the moment by their likeness to something familiar and far away, but that was all fun and exciting. It led him on, and he penetrated to where the light was less, and trees crouched nearer and nearer, and holes made ugly mouths at him on either side. Everything was very still now. The dusk advanced on him steadily, rapidly, gathering in behind and before, and the light seemed to be draining away like flood water. Then the faces began. It was over his shoulder and indistinctly that he first thought he saw a face, a little evil wedge-shaped face, looking out at him from a hole. When he turned and confronted it, the thing had vanished. He quickened his pace, telling himself cheerfully not to begin imagining things, or there would simply be no end to it. He passed another hole, and another, and then, yes, certainly a little narrow face with hard eyes had flashed up for an instant from a hole and was gone. He hesitated, braced himself up for an effort, and strode on. Then suddenly, as if it had been so all the time, every hole, far and near, and there were hundreds of them, seemed to possess its face, coming and going rapidly, all fixing on him glances of malice and hatred, all hard-eyed and evil and sharp. If he could get away from the holes in the banks, he thought, there would be no more faces. He swung off the path and plunged into the untrodden places of the wood. Then the whistling began, Very faint and shrill it was, and far behind him when first he heard it. But somehow it made him hurry forward. Then, still very faint and shrill, it sounded far ahead of him, and made him hesitate and want to go back. As he halted in indecision, it broke out on either side and seemed to be caught up and passed on throughout the whole length of the wood to its farthest limit. They were up and alert and ready, evidently, whoever they were. And he was alone and unarmed and far from any help, and the night was closing in. And here's a picture of Mole out by himself in the wild wood, in the snowy winter wood, as the sounds begin to close in. Then the pattering began. He thought it was only falling leaves at first, so slight and delicate was the sound of it. Then, as it grew, it took a regular rhythm, and he knew it for nothing else but the pat, pat, pat of little feet, and still a very long way off. Was it in front or behind? It seemed to be first one, then the other, then both. It grew, and it multiplied till from every quarter, as he listened anxiously, leaning this way and that, it seemed to be closing in on him. As he stood still to hearken, a rabbit came running hard towards him through the trees. He waited, expecting it to slacken pace or to swerve from him into a different course. Instead, the animal almost brushed him as it dashed past, his face set and hard, his eyes staring. "Get out of this, you fool! Get out!" the mole heard him mutter as he swung around a stump and disappeared down a friendly burrow. The pattering increased till it sounded like sudden hail on the dry leaf carpet spread around him. The whole wood seemed running now, running hard, hunting, chasing, closing in round something or somebody. In panic, Mole began to run too, aimlessly, he knew not whither. He ran up against things. He fell over things and into things. He darted under things and dodged round things. At last he took refuge in the deep, dark hollow of an old beech tree, which offered shelter, concealment, perhaps even safety, but who could tell? Anyhow, he was too tired to run any further, and could only snuggle down into the dry leaves which had drifted into the hollow, and hope he was safe for the time. And as he lay there, panting and trembling, and listened to the whistlings and the patterings outside, he knew it at last in all its fullness, that dread thing which other little dwellers in field and hedgerow had encountered here and known as their darkest moment, that thing which the rat had vainly tried to shield him from, the terror of the wild wood. Meanwhile, the rat, warm and comfortable, dozed by his fireside. His paper of half-finished verses slipped from his knee, his head fell back, his mouth opened, and he wandered by the verdant banks of dream rivers. Then a coal slipped. The fire crackled and sent up a spurt of flame, and he woke with a start. Remembering what he had been engaged upon, he reached down to the floor for his verses, pored over them for a minute, and then looked round for the mole to ask him if he knew a good rhyme for something or other. But the mole was not there. He listened for a time. The house seemed very quiet. Then he called, "Moley! Moley!" several times, and receiving no answer, got up and went out into the hall. The mole's cap was missing from its accustomed peg. His galoshes, which always lay by the umbrella stand, were also gone. The rat left the house and carefully examined the muddy surface of the ground outside, hoping to find the mole's tracks. There they were, sure enough. The galoshes were new, just bought for the winter, and the pimples on their soles were fresh and sharp. He could see the imprints of them in the mud, running along straight and purposeful, leading direct to the wild wood. The rat looked very grave and stood in deep thought for a minute or two. Then he re-entered the house, strapped a belt around his waist, shoved a brace of pistols into it, took up a stout cudgel that stood in the corner of the hall and set off for the wild wood at a smart pace. And there, whoops, is a picture of the rat getting ready to go on his mission of mercy. It was already getting towards dusk when he reached the first fringe of trees and plunged without hesitation into the wood, looking anxiously on either side for any sign of his friend. Here and there wicked little faces popped out of holes, but vanished immediately at sight of the valorous animal, his pistols, and the great ugly cudgel in his grasp. And the whistling and pattering which he had heard quite plainly on this first entry died away and ceased, and all was very still. He made his way manfully through the length of the wood to its furthest edge. Then, forsaking all paths, he set himself to traverse it, laboriously working over the whole ground, and all the time calling out cheerfully, "Moley! Moley! Moley! Where are you? It's me! It's old Rat!" He had patiently hunted through the wood for an hour or more when, at last, to his joy, he heard a little answering cry. Guiding himself by the sound, he made his way through the gathering darkness to the foot of an old beech tree with a hole in it, and from out of the hole came a feeble voice saying, "Ratty, is that really you?" The rat crept into the hollow, and there he found the mole, exhausted and still trembling. "Oh, Rat!" he cried, "I've been so frightened you can't think." "Oh, I quite understand," said the rat soothingly. "You shouldn't really have gone and done it, Mole. I did my best to keep you from it. We river bankers, we hardly ever come here by ourselves. If we have to come, we come in couples at least, and we're generally all right. Besides, there are 100 things one has to know, which we understand all about, and you don't as yet. I mean, passwords and signs and sayings which have power and effect, and plants you carry in your pocket, and verses you repeat, and dodges and tricks you practice. All simple enough when you know them, but they've got to be known if you're small, or you'll find yourself in trouble. Of course, if you were badger or otter, it would be quite another matter." "Surely the brave Mr. Toad wouldn't mind coming here by himself, would he?" inquired the mole. "Old Toad!" said the rat, laughing heartily. "He wouldn't show his face here alone. Not for a whole hat full of golden guineas, Toad wouldn't." The mole was greatly cheered by the sound of Rat's careless laughter, as well as by the sight of his stick and his gleaming pistols, and he stopped shivering and began to feel bolder and more himself again. "Now then," said the rat presently, "we really must pull ourselves together and make a start for home while there's still a little light left. It will never do to spend the night here, you understand. Too cold, for one thing." "Dear Ratty," said the poor mole, "I'm dreadfully sorry, but I'm simply dead beat, and that's a solid fact. You must let me rest here a while longer and get my strength back if I'm to get home at all." "Oh, all right," said the good-natured rat. "Rest away. It's pretty nearly pitch dark now anyhow, and there ought to be a bit of a moon later." So the mole got well into the dry leaves and stretched himself out and presently dropped off into sleep, though of a broken and troubled sort, while the rat covered himself up too as best he might for warmth and lay patiently waiting with a pistol in his paw. When at last the mole woke up, much refreshed and in his usual spirits, the rat said, "Now then, I'll just take a look outside and see if everything's quiet, and then we really must be off." He went to the entrance of their retreat and put his head out. Then the mole heard him saying quietly to himself, "Hello, hello, here is a go." "What's up, Ratty?" What's up, Ratty?" asked the mole. "Snow is up," replied the rat briefly, "or rather down. It's snowing hard." The mole came and crouched beside him, and looking out saw the wood that had been so dreadful to him in quite a changed aspect. Holes, hollows, pools, pitfalls, and other black menaces to the wayfarer were vanishing fast, and a gleaming carpet of fairy was springing up everywhere that looked too delicate to be trodden upon by rough feet. A fine powder filled the air and caressed the cheek with a tingle in its touch, and the black boles of the trees showed up in a light that seemed to come from below. Well, it can't be helped," said the rat after pondering. "We must make a start, and take our chance, I suppose. The worst of it is I don't know exactly where we are, and now this snow makes everything look so very different." It did indeed. The mole would not have known that it was the same wood. However, they set out bravely and took the line that seemed most promising, holding on to each other and pretending with invincible cheerfulness that they recognized an old friend in every fresh tree that grimly and silently greeted them, or saw openings, gaps, or paths with a familiar turn in them in the monotony of white space and black tree trunks that refused to vary. An hour or two later, they had lost all count of time. They pulled up, dispirited, weary, and hopelessly at sea, and sat down on a fallen tree trunk to recover their breath and consider what was to be done. They were aching with fatigue and bruised with tumbles. They had fallen into several holes and got wet through. The snow was getting so deep that they could hardly drag their little legs through it, and the trees were thicker and more like each other than ever. There seemed to be no end to this wood, and no beginning and no difference in it, and worst of all, no way out. "We can't sit here very long," said the rat. "We shall have to make another push for it and do something or other. The cold is too awful for anything, and the snow will soon be too deep for us to wade through." He peered about him and considered. "Look here," he went on, "this is what occurs to me. There's a sort of dell down there in front of us, where the ground seems all hilly and humpy and hummocky. We'll make our way down into that and try and find some sort of shelter, a cave or hole with a dry floor to it, out of the snow and the wind, and there we'll have a good rest before we try again, for we're both of us pretty dead beat. Besides, the snow may leave off, or something may turn up." So once more they got on their feet and struggled down into the dell, where they hunted about for a cave or some corner that was dry and a protection from the keen wind and the whirling snow. They were investigating one of the hummocky bits the rat had spoken of when suddenly the mole tripped and fell forward on his face with a squeal. "Oh, my leg!" he cried. "Oh, my poor shin!" And he sat up in the snow and nursed his leg in both his front paws. "Poor old mole," said the rat kindly. "You don't seem to be having much luck today, do you? Let's have a look at the leg." "Yes," he went on, going down on his knees to look. "You've cut your shins, sure enough. Wait till I get at my handkerchief, and I'll tie it up for you." "I must have tripped over a hidden branch or a stump," said the mole miserably. "Oh, my! Oh, my!" "It's a very clear cut," said the rat, examining it again attentively. "That was never done by a branch or a stump. Looks as if it was made by a sharp edge of something in metal. Funny." He pondered a while and examined the humps and slopes that surrounded them. "Well, never mind what done it," said the mole, forgetting his grammar in his pain. "It hurts just the same, whatever done it." But the rat, after carefully tying up the leg with his handkerchief, had left him and was busy scraping in the snow. He scratched and shoveled and explored, all four legs working busily, while the mole waited impatiently, remarking at intervals, "Oh, come on, rat." Suddenly the rat cried, "Hooray!" and then "Hooray, hooray, hooray, hooray!" and fell to executing a feeble jig in the snow. There's Rat and his jig. "What have you found, Ratty?" asked the mole, still nursing his leg. "Come and see," said the delighted rat as he jigged on. And that's where we're going to stop, with Rat still doing his jig and Mole coming to see.
So, assuming that everything was just as it should be. Good. Okay. So, and making sure if there's anybody else I failed to say hello to that I should have. Claudia, Christy, Mark, Joanna, Susan. I think I got everybody. Anyway, so that is where I'm going to stop. I will continue, I'm assuming, next week, barring acts of God or things of that sort. I will return at the same times as I have been doing, so nothing new there. And yeah, I think that's it. So it is now 8 o'clock. I am going to sign off. Please take good care of yourselves, your loved ones, your good friends, and anybody else around you who may need a little help. And I will see you very soon. Peace, and thank you so much for joining me.